question I would like to ask all of these Hindutva supporters is why they expected anybody in the world to sympathize with India after Pahalgam. If we do not have any sympathy for what's happening in Gaza, and then we have, we send off people on taxpayer money to go around the world drumming up sympathy for us. I mean, if that's not double standards and a contradiction, then what is?
The particular manner in which Israel has banked upon the Holocaust, okay, I think not enough can be said about the sheer monstrosity of that itself. The memory of those victims, that's what you have to believe in. You don't have to believe in Judaism necessarily to be in Israel, but you must believe in that. That's something that cannot be controverted.
There was a study that anti-Palestinian fake sort of videos in social media, maximum amount were created in India.
The RSS and the Zionists both support is the idea that there should be one ethnicity or one religion in one territory. So then it's fine to get rid of the Jews from Germany. When it comes to Israel, it's fine to get rid of Palestinians. When it comes to India, it's fine to get rid of Muslims and Christians. So it's that idea of purification in the service of a supremacist agenda, which enables them to reconcile this love for Hitler and the love for Zionism.
Everyone is proposing a two-state solution, which I think is catastrophic. I mean, Edward Said was very clear that the two-state solution, which is what Europeans and I think most people around the world are saying, let's have that. No, in fact, that's a recipe for absolute disaster.
Salam, Namaste, Zindabad viewers. I'm Harsh Mander, back with another episode of Ye Daagh, Ujaala, the series in which we are talking about broadly about the state of the Indian Republic, but other issues as well, which we're doing in collaboration with Scroll. Today, we will be reflecting on the genocidal massacre that continues to unfold in Gaza. There are moments in history like the Second World War, the Holocaust, bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Vietnam, maybe the Rwanda, Bosnia massacres, and now Gaza. Gaza, the response, what the Israeli government has done and continues to do with impunity, with the tacit or open support of powerful nations around the world, in defiance of all the principles that we thought after the Second World War, humankind had adopted a set of norms about how nations will treat each other, how peoples will treat each other. All of this, is violated with the kind of impunity which we will talk about. But in all of this, there's also the very specific question of India's role in its tacit and open support for this genocidal war that continues in Gaza, with which I think as Indians, all of us need to reflect upon, and as human beings, we have to look at how humankind has enabled this massacre to unfold. Every time you look at a news report, you look at starving children, starvation being used as an instrument of warfare, goes into the classic description of a genocide. But you hear of aid workers being killed, you hear of children lining up for food, starving children being killed. You hear of doctors being killed, health workers being killed, hospitals being brought down, journalists being killed. It's an extraordinary moment and civilian populations being attacked. Almost all of Gaza being razed to the ground. Within that, what has been the role of the Indian government and, very importantly, the Indian people? India has a proud history, right from Mahatma Gandhi's opposition to the displacement of the Palestinian people to establish the state of Israel, to Indira Gandhi's legendary support and relationship with Yasser Arafat, India's being the earliest country to recognize Palestine. We've really come a very long way from that, and I think it's time for us to reflect on where has India, in my opinion, lost its way so badly. I have two very, very fine colleagues and friends to discuss this. Vinay is a professor of history in the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. But he writes, reflects on a number of issues, and has thought and commented extensively on the war in Gaza and its implications. Welcome, Vinay. And
thank you.
And we have Nandini, Sundar, again a leading voice of public conscience, as I see. And she teaches sociology in Delhi University. So very welcome to you as well. So let me start right where what I was just speaking about. How do how culpable can the Indian government, and I want to talk about the Indian people separately, how culpable will history hold the Indian government for what it has done and not done in relation to the genocidal war in Gaza?
Well, I think I would begin with the observation that culpability here is shared by a huge number of states. To say that is not to let any one government, any one country off the hook, but I think we need to recognize that there is widespread culpability and complicity. And to varying degrees, one could say, because some countries are in a position to influence, or at least it seems that way, or one hopes that's the case, the course of events, and other countries really are not. And I agree entirely with the observation that India, the Indian state, has enormous culpability here. Although at the same time, my own view is that India is not really in the position to be able to shape the course of events. And in fact, I would even take the view that almost no country is. I mean, I think there are people who have constantly said over the course of the last 2 years, of course, the problem here extends to several decades. But if we take only the last 2 years, that is approximately the last 2 years since Hamas's attack of October 7th, 2023, there are people who have held to the view that the United States was actually in the position of being able to influence events and did not, to the extent that it did it only to aid Israel. And I have a somewhat different view of that, because I wrote very early on that whatever the US does or doesn't do, Israel was set on a course of following its own will in this matter, and that it would decimate Gaza in retaliation for Hamas's attack, and of course the fact that it took a certain number of hostages. Um, Now, if we turn to India more explicitly, uh, there are various ways in which one can assess that culpability. One is to really take only the last 2 years and see, how India has positioned itself. It was just hours after Hamas's attack that Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, called up Netanyahu and offered India's condolences and support. I think that set the tone because someone who is a little bit more judicious, let's say, would have said, well, let's reflect on what's happened, because obviously what's happened has not happened in a vacuum. I mean, even the Secretary General of the United Nations said that what's happened here is not in a vacuum. And to say that is not to exonerate the wanton killing of civilians by Hamas. And one can take a position, and I know that there are some who might even take the extreme position that, well, this is the chickens coming home to roost for Israel, etc. But if one adopts a kind of a principled position on nonviolence, then it seems to me what Hamas did is something that really can't be defended, even if one understands the entire history and understands that things didn't take place in a vacuum. But what struck me was the speed with which the Indian state immediately offers its sympathies to Israel with not a word for the Palestinians. Right? And I think that has been consistently the position of the Indian state. I find it extraordinary that even as there has been a shift in world opinion. Um, so if you look at, let's say, Western Europe, you look at countries in Scandinavia, right? I mean, these countries all essentially defended Israel's right to self-defense. In principle, they still obviously adhere to that position, but many of them now have at least had, some courage in being able to say that, well, what's happening in Gaza, the willful starvation of people, all of that, this is really tantamount to genocide. India, the Indian state has said absolutely nothing about this. And its culpability can also be demonstrated by the fact that, in fact, people who in India seek to actually show their solidarity to the Palestinians are often prevented from doing so, right? So I think that we can measure this culpability in lots of different ways. I'm not even taking into account such things as the fact that India continues to be the largest importer of arms from Israel. And obviously, if India took a principled position on this, and one of the things it would do is it would essentially try to start applying certain kind of sanctions of its own and at least terminate some of these defense contracts, right? So one can pursue that angle. There are lots of different angles that one can pursue. But I think I've said enough to suggest that there is enormous culpability on the part of India.
The UN resolutions, its position, its abstention.
Abstention on UN resolutions, all of that. That's part of the story. Yeah.
Nandini, there's just going back a little bit into our own history in India. After 2002, the Gujarat massacre, we can forget the fact that that Mr. Modi became a national kind of outcast. He was not given a visa to countries in Europe and North America. The one country that welcomed him with, as a very honored guest then was Israel. And I wonder, and I recall at the time when he was going as this honored guest to Israel, the textbooks in Gujarat actually spoke of Hitler with great praise as a great nationalist leader. It never mentioned the Holocaust. And some of us sent those textbooks to the Israel embassy and said, just be aware of who you're inviting, but that didn't make the least difference. But I also see this ideological, affinity of Zionism and Hindutva in a very ironical sense, because Hindutva's early leaders all spoke explicitly of their admiration for Hitler and for how he solved the Jewish problem. Bulwarker said that, in fact, that's exactly the course that we should follow in solving the Muslim problem. So this ideological sort of union or partnership of Hindutva and Zionism, the personal chemistry that Mr. Modi has shared with successive leaders of Israel, how much do you think that explains, and what are the other sort of, where do you hold the Indian government culpable?
On the question of culpability, I think there is a difference in the culpability of different countries. To say that everybody is complicit at some level is, I think, unfair. The US is clearly far more complicit in the genocide than many other countries. And South Africa is clearly not complicit, right? It's been fighting against that. It's the country that has brought the case to the ICC. Now, I think what India has done is it's not only culpable in terms of its support for Israel, the refusal to, its abstention on the call for ceasefire, the fact that, as was mentioned earlier, India has a very close defense relationship with Israel. We have imported $4.2 billion worth of arms from over the last 20 years. In Operation Sindoor, most recently, we used Israeli drones. So Israeli drones are not only being used against Pakistan, but also within our own borders in Bastar, in Kashmir,
right.
So Pegasus was used.
I was just going to talk about Pegasus, yes.
Famously against our own, civil rights activists, journalists, politicians. So India is obviously very dependent on Israeli technology, and Israel also benefits a lot from Indian exports of arms. So explosives, for instance, the Adani Elbit, manufacture of explosives, Premier Explosives, all of these companies actually benefit. So I think the fact that India and Israel have this cozy arms relationship is a major form of culpability, because unlike other countries, like Spain, for instance, docked a ship that was carrying explosives loaded at Chennai. And Indian workers, the Indian people have not protested in the way that we have seen elsewhere in the world. Now, of course, there is state repression. There was a protest of 3 people in Jantar Mantar, and they were all forcibly arrested. There's been almost no student protest on campus. So, of course, and there have been students. There's been this brave student group, Disha, which has been protesting against the genocide in front of McDonald's and across cities, and they keep getting picked up and arrested and beaten up. So repression apart, there's also, as you said, a great deal of ideological comfort that has been sold to the Indian public by the Indian government. And if you look at, simple things like, there was V.K. Tripathi, who's a retired professor at IIT, has announced that he will be on a one-day fast on 15th August to protest against the genocide. And the kinds of horrible comments that you get on Twitter, the kind of stuff that the Bombay High Court said when it refused permission to the CPM to hold a rally in Gandhi Maidan, saying that, why are you concerned about Gaza, and you should be concerned about potholes in Bombay, as if there is no government in Mumbai that should be concerned about it, and it's only the responsibility of the CPM. All of that really is a betrayal of India's own position, because, as you said, right from Gandhi and Nehru, India has recognized the rights of the Palestinians. In fact, even earlier, going back to the 1920s, when the first bits of settlement started. But I think what really, as you said, brings the two countries together is their hatred for Muslims
Yeah.
and Christians in a way. And this quote from Golwalkar that Germany has shown to the world how
Yeah.
impossible it is for races to live together is actually not. I mean, they're not concerned about who those races are at any point in time. What the RSS and the Zionists both support is the idea that there should be one ethnicity or one religion in one territory.
Yes.
So whether at that point it's Germany, whether Aryans or Germans in Germany, or so then it's fine to get rid of the Jews from Germany. When it comes to Israel, it's fine to get rid of Palestinians. When it comes to India, it's fine to get rid of Muslims and Christians. So it's that idea of purification in the service of a supremacist agenda, which enables them to reconcile this love for Hitler and the love for Zionism. So I think that's the fundamental ideological, this kind of fascist supremacism, which wants to cleanse other people who are entitled to claim that land, to coexist, to live in any particular space. The second thing, I think, which both India and Israel pride, or this, not India and Israel, I would say the RSS and the Zionists,
Yes.
have really built themselves on, is this feeling of victimization that they've sold to their constituencies as something that has been inflicted upon them, whereas they are the ones who have been doing the victimization.
And they've been victimized, and it justifies their hatred for a vulnerable minority.
Yeah, but in the case of India, in the case of the Hindus, they have not even been victimized by anybody, right?
Yeah, this construction of victimization. Yes.
Yeah, so but at the same time, they've built this construction of being victimized by Muslims, by the Mughals, by the last 1,000 years of colonialism, so-called. So India has really, like the RSS has really drawn on this sense that we are now entitled to go back to some ancient past, which is what the Zionists are also claiming, right? That they own the land because, so many thousands of years ago they were there. The other thing is, again, this you see this in a whole variety of different ways in which India has, the Indian government under the BJP, under the RSS, has modeled itself on the idea that one religion, people of one religion are more entitled to citizenship in a particular state. So if you look at Israeli citizenship laws,
Right.
It is a form of apartheid, right?
Yes.
And the CAA was an attempt to introduce the idea that India is the homeland for Hindus, regardless of wherever else they come from, and all other faiths are
and not
second.
a homeland for Muslims, even
and
if
the people who live here,
yeah,
Muslims, Christians, Adivasis, Jains, Buddhists, whatever, but it's a Hindu homeland. So you see it in this kind of strict equation of territory, religion, or ethnicity, this feeling of being victimized, this use of laws to reduce other people to second class citizenship. You see it in the way that the whole Ayodhya thing was blown up on to exclude all of these mosque takeovers, right? Whether it's Ayodhya or it's Shahidgah or etc., is sort of very similar to the way that the Zionists are trying to take over Al-Aqsa and exclude Palestinians from worshipping there. So India is really ideologically under this government, and I shouldn't say India because this is really an RSS agenda. And because the RSS is in power, they are infecting the whole of the Indian population with the idea that this is an acceptable way to behave. And that's what we see.
Likewise, it's not about Israel, but it's about
Zionism.
the Zionist government and so on. But I just wanted to stay with the question of the Indian people. So a few friends decided that we'd gather at Nehru Place and do a surprise kind of protest. It was such a modest protest that we were given posters and the flag of Palestine. We were instructed, you go to shops and just move around. And at 12:30, all of us suddenly gathered and we'd put up the flag, no slogans, and the poster. It was really a modest protest, very symbolic. Literally within 5 to 7 minutes, and this was an unannounced protest, a crowd gathered, and it was a very aggressive crowd. I work with lynch mobs. It had the energy of hate on people's faces, like a lynch mob. And it literally took 5 to 7 minutes for them to gather. They were the ones who called in the police, and they just kept screaming and shouting, and they said a lot, which the RSS says. You Musliman desh hai, it's a Muslim country, that's why you're speaking out. That was one of the things they said. Why aren't you concerned about when Bangladeshi Hindus were being massacred, you didn't come here, etc., etc. And they kept, and then people started throwing things, mud, rotten tomatoes, etc. The police kept pushing us. We kept trying. I tried to argue with people. Why are you being anti-national? I said, I love my country. That's why I'm standing here. I can't bear to see my country lose its way. But obviously there was no space for that kind of dialogue. And the cops actually kept pushing us. And I was struck by the fact that was the violent crowd. This was a very peaceful group of people who didn't even raise a slogan. But all of their action was here. Their backs were turned. And so I started asking the cops, what are you doing? And this cop got very agitated, and he said, when Operation Sindoor happened, why didn't you come here and protest? So I said, I wasn't quite sure what I was supposed to be protesting when Operation Sindoor happened. But so it was in that moment sort of just brought home to me that this is not just an issue of the Indian state. I mean, there's a much more, there is a considerable degree of popular hatred that they have been able to generate. There was a study that anti-Palestinian fake sort of videos and social media, maximum amount were created in India. I mean, that's terrifying to think that. So, those famous videos where people, where they claim this group of girls were going, Israeli girls were going for a picnic, and they said this was sex trades and that babies were slaughtered. A lot of that was created in India. So there's and the third is the absence of protest. And we, in places like the United States and in many countries in Europe and Germany, where I teach, the consequences are actually very severe on students. And yet everywhere I saw large protests. I saw the encampment was there. I went to Japan. I saw an encampment there. I don't see those anywhere. Where students sit, they defy. We're not seeing that kind of defiance also in Indian universities. You spoke about Disha, etc. But they're very small protests. Even the protest that we did, I was almost embarrassed by how modest it was, and suddenly its reaction was so much. So, is there something that this movement also reflects on the larger problems of Indian society? Has Islam, hatred of Muslims, grown so deep that it colors how we view moral questions of children being slaughtered, doctors, hospitals being, why have we not starvation happening? What is it that is, what's happening to the Indian people in relation to Gaza?
Right. Well, I mean, I think there are lots of different considerations here that we would have to think about, but I'll just take a stab at a few of them. I would like to begin first with the observation that we have to think about the nature of democracy in this country. And what I'm going to say here is not to undermine whatever achievements have been accomplished, such as, for example, the idea of one person, one vote, universal franchise. Um, this is something that came at the onset of the Republic. And I think people have learned how to use the vote to advance their own interests, particularly when they can constitute themselves into a bloc, into a community of some kind. Now, there are certainly many critiques of what happens when democracy gets reduced to electoral democracy. And I'm alluding to those critiques when I suggest that we shouldn't undermine the achievements of electoral democracy. But it appears to me that those achievements, all things considered, are in the larger scale of things very marginal, particularly in a country such as India, because I think we are very far removed from what I would describe as social democracy. A social democracy is a way of understanding a society where one begins to entertain democratic sentiments towards the other, and does so in such a way that the other becomes more proximate to oneself. I mean, the most radical form of that, which I don't think has been achieved in any society, but that most radical form of that, where would be one would actually host the otherness of the other within oneself. Now, I think that there were moments in India when we came very close to doing that, actually. We didn't have the word for democracy. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that I think that if you look at what is called the Ganga Yamuna Tehzeeb, that is the culture in the Doab between the two rivers, and I'm aware of the critiques. I'm aware of those who say, well, this is all romanticized and so on, but we can't have a lengthy discussion on that. I'm just simply offering my own position on that. That in that culture, particularly when you had people like Gandhi around, who really represents a kind of ecumenism, which I think is absolutely extraordinary, that the Muslim felt himself or herself to be incomplete without recognizing something of the Hindu within themselves. And the Hindu likewise felt himself or herself to be incomplete without recognizing something of the Muslim within themselves. This might have been purely tacit. Nobody needed to have theorized it as such. Okay? And in that sense, there was a certain kind of democratic sentiment. Now, I don't think that we really have democratic sentiments towards each other in this country. And one of the reasons we don't is that we have very deep-seated notions of hierarchy, which are usually played out under the sign of caste, but not always, Right? So I think that's the first set of considerations, because your question is, what's happened to us as a people, right? That when you and a handful of other people, maybe 10, 15, 20, whatever, just wage a silent protest, suddenly there's a ruckus over it, and you're a crowd or let's use that word, mob, which has its own politics, descends there and out of the blue, as it were, and trying to disrupt your protest. And it's quite obvious the violence is on their side, not on your side, but you're the ones who are now going to be, as it were, charged by the police, right? So what's happened to us as a people that something like this becomes possible? Now, there were other thoughts that were entertained in the discussion. So, for example, the hatred for the Muslim, for example, and it was suggested by Nandini, and of course I would agree that one of the things that ties together India and Israel is this idea that the Muslim is our enemy, right? In fact, I would say that there is a kind of a triad which began to develop in the early 2000s. And there are ways to politically demonstrate that. And that triad was, an attempted triad of United States, Israel, and India as three alleged democracies that were basically under siege from Muslims. right? We have to remember the history of Islamophobia in the United States as well, right? The history of that in India and Israel is all too evident, obviously, but certainly in the US as well. So I think that's part of the story. The other part of the story has to do um, with a profound kind of insularity that I find in India. And again, whether one finds this kind of insularity in the United States, I mean, I spend, 3/4 of my time or 2/3 of my time there, and the remaining time largely in India or elsewhere. And certainly I'm aware of the kind of insularity that one finds in the US as well. But here, it's all too palpable. How is it all too palpable? I mean, I find that there's virtually no coverage in our newspapers of international events. What's going on in the Congo or Sudan or something like that. It's an absolute blank there, right? But I also find it. I mean, it was such as the event we held on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The supposition is that this is someone else's problem, or why should we be interested in something like what happened in Hiroshima or Nagasaki 80 years ago? Now, I think that is part of the problem here, because before you can really get committed to some kind of a protest, some kind of enterprise, one needs to have some awareness of what is it about, really, fundamentally, right? And one can then, of course, begin to really broaden this set of questions into other questions. I mean, if you're looking, let's say, at the era of Nehru, but I would say it really goes back to the 1930s, even the late 1920s, when you begin to see people like Nehru, Kamala Devi, Ram Manohar Lohiya, many others. Even, by the way, someone like Lala Lajpat Rai, who doesn't reckon anywhere within the vision of the left, but in the ordinary sense of the term. But interestingly, he took a trip to the US. And what you find is that these people are writing quite widely on the rest of the world. Okay. And of course, then when you move into the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, then you have to start to think of, the Bandung movement. You have to start to think of solidarity. And see, anti-colonial movements generated a lot of activity in many countries. Now we're living in a very different era. That solidarity cannot be derived, as it was so easily, from the anti-colonial movements that, in a sense, made it possible to think of, Asia, Africa, portions of Latin America, right, in relationship to each other. And this, I would say, is again part of the story of what is it that's happened to us, as a people. But, one could obviously take a much simpler position, and that simpler position has to do with the fact that people who get involved in protests and so on understand that the stakes are quite high, the risks are quite high in this country, frankly, right? I mean, we can see that you can have a comedian who has something to say against the present political dispensation and may have to pay a price for that, right? Now, the fact that it's increasingly happening in many other countries is no solace at all. But I think that there are common people who understand the risks that you undertake, right?
Yeah, I think I'm very persuaded by the things you said. But in that little encounter, I was struck by the fact that they had a little bit of knowledge. I mean, they talked about Hamas. I mean, when they were screaming,
Yeah.
they were talking about Hamas. They talked about the hostages. They talked about, different aspects. Nandini,
But are they going to understand the Oslo Accords, and are they going to understand the fact that everyone is proposing a two-state solution, which I think is catastrophic? I mean, Edward Said was very clear that the two-state solution, which is what Europeans and I think most people around the world are saying, let's have that. No, in fact, that's a recipe for absolute disaster, you know.
That's another
Right?
question.
But
I
so
think.
so that's a different level of awareness of what's happening, you know.
Nandi, I just wanted to draw your attention to the university. I mean, to the students and their passivity on this issue, but also the working class. I mean, the idea of workers willingly being recruited to replace Palestinian workers, Ukrainian workers, that itself is again something that troubles me, because working class solidarity, youth student solidarities, which when we were younger you took somewhat for granted, don't seem to be working.
As Vinay said, I think the moment that we are in is quite different from the Nehruvian moment of third world international solidarity. We also see a huge decline in the left, and that the left movement has always been a source of
Yeah.
international solidarity, information about international movements. I mean, it's always been more internationalist than the right, even though the right also, the Indian RSS had its links with, I mean, Munje went to see Mussolini and learned from that. But I think if you look at even the textbooks that students today, even the good textbooks that they've had, are very different from what we studied. We had Bipin Chandra's Modern India, which had a whole lot of section on, I mean, a whole lot of stuff on anti-colonial movements. So they just aren't exposed to, um, international solidarities in that way. They are concerned about, say, climate change, and that is a different kind of international solidarity. So I wouldn't say they have like no knowledge of the world at large, but the kinds of things that are coming to them are somewhat different from the kinds of things that we studied or were exposed to. But also, I'm not sure that I want to kind of write off the Indian people as a whole, because I think that, um, different subsections of the population get their news from very different places. Like Kerala, for instance, I think is getting its news from other places than your Nehru Place traders, right? Or, for instance, I went to this meeting organized by the Jamaat Women's Wing, and they really, one of the speakers was just so up to date on what was happening in Palestine, gave such a wonderful speech on how it affected women, how it was affecting the population. So I think different sections of our
There's
population
stirrings of different
are
kind.
differentially aware of what's happening. Many people probably have a lot of sympathy with Palestine, but they're unable to express it. And as Vinay said, the dominant media simply just doesn't speak about international issues in general, leave alone something like Palestine, which goes against the Indian government's stated position on it. So I think it's a bit more complicated, and
But
I'm not writing off anyone as
no,
yet.
no, no. That's great, and I value your observations. But I'm still talking about Delhi University. I mean, where I studied, and I think you studied, and why is that not a place of social political concern at a moment like this?
It never has been. If you look at Delhi University versus JNU or even Jadavpur or HCU, DU has always had, unions which are dominated either by the ABVP or by the NSUI. They have not had that kind of vibrant political culture that JNU has had. So I don't think this is particularly new. It's not like, DU has been in the last 20 years.
Very progressive in
DU hardly has had anything.
Yes.
So, I mean, we can't even talk about Kashmir or Maoism. And I mean, since 2016, they've kind of banned all seminars in DU. There's been a total clamp down on all extracurricular activities. We have lots of RSS events where, various RSSers have, I mean, whenever their leaders are invited to give talks and so on. But there's been a general decline of seminars.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at Harvard from a distance, I mean, it's not even a left-leaning kind of university, but they have taken a stand and are suffering consequences of it.
But so have our students. Look, starting with the first people who protested against the Modi government were students across the country, FTII, JNU, Jadavpur, BHU women, Osmania University, Madras, the whole beef festival issue in Madras.
So, and the CA protests, which were in universities across.
Yeah, so I don't think that our students have been quiet at all. They have been the only ones really protesting. Students, farmers, Adivasis, Kashmiris, they've all been like severely repressed and
speaking out.
Yeah, and I don't think Harvard Columbia did such a terrible job of, kowtowing. As an alum of Columbia, I'm sad about the fact that it gave in so quickly. And many of our universities have still resisted in some way or the other.
So I think what I'm hearing from you is that it is not as if the Indian people are alienated from what is happening in Palestine. Sections of the Indian people have expressed concern in the ways that they have, and many of them are not exposed to the ideas of. But I fear that the sweeping anti-Muslim sentiment in the country has also colored the responses of larger sections of. Like in that protest, they kept saying, because it's a Muslim country, you're standing here.
So one thing I would like to ask all of these Hindutva supporters is why they expected anybody in the world to sympathize with India after Pahalgam. Yeah. If we do not have any sympathy for what's happening in Gaza, and then we have, we send off people on taxpayer money to go around the world drumming up sympathy for us. If that's not double standards and a contradiction, then what is?
Absolutely.
So why should anyone care about Pahalgam? Except that everybody should care about injustice everywhere in the world.
Yes.
So people should care about Pahalgam and they should care about Palestine. And of course, Palestine is on a huge scale.
I'm aware of the time passing. But what does this moment mean for humankind? What is the moral and political lesson of how the world, large sections of the world, have enabled the kind of genocide that we thought, televised genocide that we thought would not be possible? What does it mean? Where's humankind in this moment? At a more reflective level, I thought, if you could, both of you, give some thought to that, and we close the discussion there.
Well, again, Harsh, I think it's obviously an important, question. What does this moment represent, and what kind of ethical reflections one might want to bring to bear upon this moment. And there are obviously, many dimensions to this. Let's begin perhaps with something like the phrase that you used. I remember when I was growing up, there used to be a book by Will Durant called The Lessons of History.
Yeah.
And somehow, this always keeps on coming up. Since I teach history, everybody says, what are the lessons? Frankly, I'm not sure there are any lessons. People also say that, why do we have to keep reinventing the wheel on everything? But it seems that
we do.
We do. So I think we just have to drop all of that and just think really about what the conjuncture at this moment really, represents. So, if you go back to, let's say, the post-World War II period, see, our world is pervaded by rights talk. It's a different matter that rights are very often not honored, human rights. They're constantly violated, and in most countries, the state is in fact actually the most egregious violator of
human
rights.
Yes.
We have a fundamental problem here because lots of human rights activists also look to the state to offer redressal, but the state itself is in fact the violator of human rights to a disproportionate degree often. But what is very clear is that in the aftermath of post-World War II, what emerged was the kind of treaties and conventions we have, which essentially shaped our understanding, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, our understanding of the rights and entitlements that a person uh, ought to have, right? And I think that where we are today suggests the massive shortcomings of that particular uh, apparatus.
Why do you say that?
Well, I'm getting to that. The massive shortcomings of that apparatus with respect to international governmentality and so on. Well, I think the reason I say that is palpably clear from what's happening in Gaza. I mean, let's not forget that the International Court of Justice it hasn't given its final verdict. It's given an interim kind of verdict in a way. But apart from the International Court of Justice, the UN every day has been issuing a denunciation of what's happening there, at least for the last 1 year. The UN has a special rapporteur on human rights in the occupied territories. I mean, you read the recent reports of Francesca Albanese, you know, where her most recent report is a remarkable document in many ways, right? And what is a document? It's a document about how we have moved from an economy of occupation to an economy of genocide. It just came out 2 days ago. And one of the things she talks about is the fact that, you know, if you look at the cloud services that the IDF uses, well, who do you think furnishes? Amazon, Google, Microsoft. I mean, you know, she documents the degree of complicity of all of these corporations. But here again, it looks like we have to reinvent the wheel, because if you go back to Nazi Germany, I mean, Auschwitz, Birkenau, where the killings took place, Auschwitz was, you know, I'm not getting into the technicalities of Auschwitz 1, 2, 3 and all of that, but Auschwitz was the site of the largest company in Germany. They had a whole plant in Auschwitz. I'm talking about IG Farben. That's the nature of these institutions. It's the nature of the beast, you see. Now, I don't think any kind of international convention on this or that is going to do and make a fundamental difference. I won't say an iota of difference, because there are instances where it does make a difference. And I'm not, of course, saying that we need to write these off, but what I'm saying is that, again, I don't think that this world that was shaped in the aftermath of World War II can offer the kind of protections that ordinary people need and require and should definitely get. It's simply not possible. That's part of the story of the conjuncture of where we are. Now, we would have to bring in a lot of other elements into the story. One of those elements unquestionably has to do with, you know, leave aside climate change, which is part of the conjuncture of where we are at the moment, and its perils and hazards, inequality. Every single index that you can think of shows the growing inequality between nations and within nations. And again, let's not forget that the conventions that became part of the language of at least liberals include such thing as that the conception of rights was not limited to political rights. It included economic rights, social rights, cultural rights. There's a whole host of documents about that, you know.
But Vinay, I think that's a long conversation.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a failure of the regime, the idea of rights.
Yeah.
It's a failure of the moral and political adherence to that framework. And what you're saying, I think, is that we haven't developed corrective mechanisms for holding those failures accountable.
What I'm saying is this. You see, I don't think that you can capture the idea of what is required of the moral imagination only through rights. The fundamental intellectual problem in the second half of the 20th century was a supposition that you could capture it just through that.
No, I think fraternity,
No.
the idea of fraternity is probably central to.
Well, this is where we go
central to
back
the
to such
moral
things as
imagination.
social democracy and so on. That you that you know it, I have to. This line is always very useful. Okay, this is from Gandhi's trial in 1922 when he was put on trial on charges of sedition, and he says, and I'm quoting his exact words. He says, "Affection cannot be manufactured by the law. The law can tell you that you can't discriminate against me simply on the basis of my color or the fact that I'm disabled or that I'm a woman or trans or this or that. That is on the basis of those kind of conceptions through which primordial conceptions through which identity is formulated. Right? It can say you can't discriminate on the basis of that, but the law cannot tell you that Mr. Mander has to have affection for Mr. Lal. Right? How do you actually so to speak, produce affection? Right?
I think the question was that what is displayed by how the world, much of the world, is responded and not responded to a televised genocide in Gaza, reflects that humankind, in a sense, has not developed mechanisms of solidarity and care.
No, I don't think so at all. I think the number of people who are protesting about Gaza shows that
there is
a large population which believes in solidarity, which objects strongly to starvation and to genocide. I think what this moment has shown us very clearly is that the liberal hypocrisy that states depended on, that powerful states depended on, has been shown up to be exactly that, liberal hypocrisy. It's been shown up as straightforward racism, the fact that you can have completely double standards on Ukraine and on Gaza. And it shows up that states are really not accountable to the opinions of their people. It shows that the current lot of right-wing regimes that we have are working very explicitly and openly and unashamedly in favor of large corporations, which benefit them and which benefit their cronies. I mean, the way that Modi is working in favor of Adani and not in favor of the people of India. Or it also shows that we cannot assume that this was ever actually a rights-based order. It was claimed to be a rights-based order by those who were benefiting from this whole. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the whole rhetoric around World War II, right, that this was a fight about freedom against fascism, and what it was, what Britain and other colonies were doing to, Kenya straight after that, what happened with South Africa, that it wasn't really about freedom, right? Or slavery and Jim Crow in the US. So that this was all sort of rhetoric for themselves, not really for, it wasn't really about actual rights and actual solidarity, but people across the world are outraged. I mean, I don't think that this is at all a moment when we can say that solidarity is dead. It's just the lack of the blatant racism and greed of some people has been very clearly exposed. And I think what's significant also about this moment is not, I mean, for the first, there was an article recently in Haaretz by Blackman about comparing Holocaust denial, by the Turkish state and people of the Armenian genocide, and what is happening in Gaza. So for the first time, this exceptionalism that was accorded to the Holocaust in the West and thereby imposed on the whole world is, I think, being broken to show that people have to be vigilant, because it can happen anywhere. I mean, what the Belgians did in the Congo, I mean, Césaire talks about that, right? That, or Bauman talks about it, that the idea that the Holocaust was exceptional and it was really practiced first on the colonies and then perfected in the West, right? And now it's being transposed to Gaza and practiced in a different form. But it's that no person on earth can afford to let their moral guard down, because we are all equally vulnerable to becoming, given the context,
it can turn.
we're all capable of being fascists and we have to fight against that wherever we are. And I think that's becoming very clear to everybody, that no country has a safe pass. Just because they were victimized doesn't mean they're not going to do it to other people.
No, that's wonderful. I think.
And also, I just want to come in on one more thing. It's also showing us that the idea of a two-state solution is, as Vinay said, a monstrosity. It would effectively be an apartheid state, with Gaza being reduced to what it has been, with environment, everything destroyed. There is no possibility of Gaza being a viable state along with the West Bank. So it has to be a one equal state with equal citizenship for all. And I don't see why, if we in India are fighting for equal citizenship for all, we should accept a state anywhere else in the world which has two tiers of citizenship. I mean, nowhere else in the world would you accept that.
I just want to add one thing. I agree with what she's saying, but I think, the particular manner in which Israel has banked upon the Holocaust, okay?
For its
I
defense.
think not enough can be said about the sheer monstrosity of that itself. There's a very interesting book by Esther Ben-Bassa where she, Suffering as Identity, that's what the book is called. And what the fundamental argument there is that, if you really look at Israel, the book is about 15, 20 years old, that, if you go to a place like Tel Aviv, for example, I mean, most of the people you would encounter there are what you would have called secular Jews. They didn't really even, especially in Tel Aviv, they didn't even observe the Shabbat, unlike in Jerusalem, many of the Jews. I think things have changed as a consequence of the last 2 years. Right? There's a very recent poll which was conducted 2 days ago by the Israeli Democracy Institute, where 80%, 79% of Israelis said, we're not really concerned about the famine and the starvation going on. This is all overstated. Now, to go back to her argument, what she's saying is that the real religion of Israel is the civic religion that you must hold the Holocaust, the memory of it, as sacred. The memory of those victims. That's what you have to believe in. You don't have to believe in Judaism necessarily to be in Israel, but you must believe in that. That's something that cannot be controverted, you see. And she's absolutely right. And what's happened in the last 2 years has shown the ways in which Israel has really exploited the Holocaust, to be able to garner world sympathy and all of that. I mean, and one can get into other psychoanalytic strands about what happens to those who were brutalized, and what they do in turn to others. But we don't have to go down that road,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very apparent that never again was it never again for some people, or never again for all people, and I think that question has come through. Nandini, I mean, I really valued what you were saying. I think this moment has exposed governments which claim to stand for democracy and rights and fraternity. How hollow are those claims? I think that has been exposed. But there are stirrings among people, including among Jewish people. I mean, some very large protests have happened by Jewish people against what their government is doing in Palestine. So I think that's where you're seeing hope, and I resonate with that. I just like just closing remarks on where do we go from here as humankind. I'm not talking about as Indians in particular. Where should we go from here?
I think we should try and make more and more people in India. I mean, we located here need to keep bringing up the issue of Palestine.
Yeah, we should have these conversations.
We should have more of these conversations. So thank you, Harsh, for organizing this.
Yeah, I
really
really felt it needs to be spoken and articulated that our states, our governments might fail us, but we should not fail the people of Palestine.
Well, I can only second what Nandini has said. We need to continue to have dialogues and conversations on this, but we need to resist in our own particular way, whether one does it by joining a demonstration, whether one does it as an artist, whether one does it through words, through speech, through writing. I think reflection is always necessary. I think it's, I think we should be a little wary of jumping to conclusions too quickly. For example, even though I would unquestionably place myself among those who are opposed to Zionism, I know from my own reading over the years that Zionism has many histories. Spiritual Zionism and political Zionism are different projects. Sometimes the political Zionists have deployed spiritual Zionism, but they are spiritual Zionists who were ferociously opposed to the creation of the State of Israel at that time and are still opposed. So I think part of where we go from here is to reflect with the awareness that reflection sometimes is not sufficient. It's always a prerequisite, I think, but it's not sufficient because obviously the world keeps on changing, and while we're living, and there are repercussions and consequences for people, right? As we're seeing, right? So I think that's part of where we go from here. And I think in this case, I mean, if somebody asked me for a very practical kind of thing, I mean, I'm actually outright in favor of a complete boycott of the State of Israel. I think, I mean, it's not going to happen, but when I say complete, I mean to the extent where I think, it's necessary to sever relationships, make it difficult for an Israeli to travel. And it's immaterial whether one particular Israeli herself or himself is, part of the movement of solidarity, because what we're really speaking about here is how do you hold a state culpable without continuing to enter into the cycle of war and violence, So I think that, we'd have to start thinking about all of that too.
Also, the BDS movement, we can spread awareness of that, stop people, it's hard to stop Google, but Amazon one can not subscribe to. Just whatever one can in whichever way.
Yeah, I think, the complete severance of ties with Israel to the extent that the Israeli people would suffer, I might have questions about that. But I think that most of all, it's a reminder that the many lessons that we had assumed humankind had learned by the middle of the last century about the equal worth of every human being, about injustice anywhere being injustice to me. These were lessons that, at least when we were growing up, we thought humankind had learned. Clearly, we still have a long way to go in deepening our individual solidarities, solidarities with people who suffer violence and injustice. But I think a much greater process of holding our own governments accountable for these failures. But this is really the first of a conversation that we are holding on Palestine. I think many questions have been raised, but some have been partially answered. But I think we need to continue to find our way in this very tangled moment in human history. So thank you both of you for being here. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
ये दाग दाग उजाला ये शब गजीदा सहर, वो इंतजार था जिसका, ये वो सहर तो नहीं।